Want to get started with sourdough but don't know how? Today's video may help. In my quest to get the perfect loaf, I've learned a few things along the way, and I'm here to share them with you. Fall is the perfect time to get a sourdough starter started. All the leaves falling create a lot of molds and yeast in the air, which is the base of your sourdough starter. Wild yeast will make for a wild dough. Remember, it is alive. Hi, welcome back. If it's your first time here, I'm Diane Lalomia. Good to see you. Today I'm going to be talking about sourdough starter. Yes, in order to do sourdough, you need a starter. And there's only one place that I know to get starter is from the air. Wild yeast. That's what I did with my starter, and that's what I'm going to show you today. Right now, my starter has become an adult and lives in the fridge, and so we'll get her out in just a minute. I know I call them the Yeastie Boys, but after all, that one in the fridge is my mother. Kind of like kefir, kombucha, apple cider vinegar, they all have mothers. Well, sourdough starters have a mother, and that's the way you think of it. I call it Mamma Mia because I'm Italian. You know, a starter is a lot like having a child. They start out as a newborn, needing lots of attention, and they need that attention, but they sleep a lot. All the naps they take, it really doesn't take much time with a starter either. A lot of people think they have to have a lot of time to spend on sourdough, but that's not necessarily true. You can do sourdough even if you work full time. But it does take more time in the beginning when you're first getting your starter started. Say that fast 3 times. You know, after a while then, when I would say like day 4 or 5, it start getting a little active. The starter will start to bubble and you'll get excited. It's kind of like having a toddler, you know, where they get this burst of energy and then they crash and burn. Well, that's kind of like the starter. 4 or 5 days into your starter, you may see a lot of activity and then nothing for maybe several days. Well, I noticed around day 7 to 10, a personality kind of develops. It routinely rises, but it takes a while. Like mine took 8 to 10 hours, and it wasn't always dependable. Sometimes it would be 8 hours, and then one day it was like 4 hours, and then it was 8 hours. What I wanted was something dependent. But I was getting to know my starter, and I suggest that if you're going to have a sourdough starter, get to know your starter. Understand its rising tendencies and what it likes, like what kind of flour it likes. We'll get into that a little later. Well, then the starter becomes a teenager. Around day 14, it starts acting mature. You get a rise out of it on a regular basis every 3 to 4 hours. That's what you would be looking for to start baking with it, or using it as a discard recipe or a starter. And we'll talk about the difference between discard and active starter in a little while. But this is about the time that you feel like your starter's eating you out of house and home. Every day you're feeding it that flour. But by now, this time, around day 14 and on, you're perfectly safe to start saving that discard in another jar. And that's what my Mamma Mia is now. She was the discard, but she became the main starter. It's kind of confusing, but I'll try to clarify it. They're really all the same thing, but just called different names. But there are also some differences that make them more unique in their makeup or personality. Well, when they're a teenager, around day 14 to about a month old, a teenager wants to try new things. Well, the same goes for your starter. You might want to try different flowers. If your starter seems a little sluggish and maybe on the liquidy side, you might want to see if it likes something else to eat. Can you imagine always having the same meal day in and day out? Well, the starter feels the same way. Some people will use rye flour because I think rye must have a lot of yeast on the actual grain, because that's where most of your yeast population for your starter in the wild yeast comes from. The other yeast that populates your starter is going to come from your environment, your kitchen. The temperature and the humidity makes a big difference, and we'll talk about that more later. We're trying to keep things simple. At least I am, because I'm a simple person, and it makes things a lot easier to remember. I would first recommend that once your starter's a month old, then you can store it in the fridge like I'm doing with mine. But up until that time, you want to keep it active and growing and maturing. I noticed that my starter changed its scent. With sourdough, you're going to be using all your senses. It's very sensual, if you ask me. I like to use my hands to mix my dough and work with the dough so that I can feel the texture and know what the dough is telling me, because that is the most important once you start making bread. Reading and understanding your dough. And the first thing is knowing your starter. Well, that's kind of a wrap up as far as the starter and how its personality can affect how it acts, its age, and everything. But I always take the time to smell my starter and to see if there is a difference or a change. I noticed in the beginning my whole grain, hard red wheat starter that I used, that's the flour I used to start with my starter, and fed it routinely, that particular grain, when I fed it in the beginning. But once it got about 14 days old, I started giving it a variety of flours, whatever I was grinding that day, and I had extra. But I noticed that it originally had kind of a yeasty smell, kind of a beer-like smell. And then suddenly, around, I'd say maybe day 14, it started smelling more like a grassy, like, it's hard to describe, but kind of that smell. And it really perked up and started coming alive. I actually almost gave up on my starter because it was the third time I tried with my starter. And I did this back in the 90s. Yeah, back when it was real popular, probably long before you were born. But anyways, I digress. I took 3 times this time to get a starter going. And I was ready to throw this one out on about day 14. It just wasn't acting like it should. It wasn't bubbling as much as it should. It had little bubbles, but nothing to write home about. So I took it on a field trip. Yep, out in the backyard. I put it on a screen that was up off the ground, but under some trees. And it was early fall, and it was a windy day. My jar had a coffee filter and a rubber band over the top. You'll see that's how I get my starter started. But I left it out there for several hours while I worked in the garden. Then after I came into the house, I put it on the kitchen windowsill. It sat there for several hours before it was cold and had to close the windows. The next day when I fed it, it took off and it showed me all about what a starter is supposed to look like. It was having a blast. It was full of good yeast that it had collected outdoors. I guess my kitchen wasn't as dirty as I thought. Oh well, let's get started with our starter. And I'm going to show you day by day what you need to do. Okay. Let me introduce you to one of the Yeastie Boys. Actually, this is the one I call Mamma Mia. It's got kind of a sweet smell now. This one needs to be fed. It's a little runnier than usual. It's starting to develop a clear kind of liquid on top. I'll show you some photographs of ones that are really hungry. But she's getting hungry and we're going to feed her. So stay tuned. I'm going to show you how to get started. I'm going to show you how to use this starter, Mamma Mia. And we'll get to bacon before you know it. In the meantime, have patience. It takes time. Nothing develops easily, and sourdough is no exception. Okay, it's time to get started with your starter. This is a day 0. It's kind of the birthday of your starter. Ground 0, if you will. And this is important, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But I use a scale, and most bakers use a scale because it's much more accurate than measuring in cups. I use a hard wheat berry that's freshly ground for my starter. It has a high protein content, and the higher protein contents allow for the gluten structure in the starter to be more successful. You don't want to use a soft flour, a soft wheat variety, because the protein content is lower in soft wheat. Or you don't want to use a bleached flour if you're using all-purpose flour. The bleach can kill the yeast and the bacteria that you're trying to grow in your starter. I used a hard red wheat for mine. You can grind the flour in advance if you are grinding for a project and have leftover, which this is what this is. Usually I don't have nearly this much. I put it in the refrigerator because I knew it was going to be a couple of days before I got started. But it's best to leave your flour on the counter at room temperature when feeding your starter. The cold retards the starter activity and retards the growth. So leaving it at room temperature is okay. I know you're not supposed to store freshly ground flour at room temperature because of its tendency to go rancid. However, it doesn't pay to run the grinder for just a little bit of flour when you're feeding your starter. And leftovers is a good thing to use because oftentimes you'll find you have just a little extra. It's usually less than a pint jar. Today I'm going to start the starter with 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of lukewarm room temperature water. This is a 50-50 gram, so equal parts. One part is 50 grams, the other part is 50 grams. Later down the road, we'll be talking about the 1:1:1 ratio, written 1:1:1. It means equal parts. No matter what it weighs, it's equal to each other. Just keep that in mind. Today, I'm going to start with, I have 2 jars, and that's for weighing and tearing the scale. You can take a jar that you're going to use and get the weight and write it down and keep the weight so you can subtract to figure out how much your flour weighs, your water weighs, etc. I find it much easier just to keep an extra jar handy, and then I'll use the extra jar for my water. I put it on the scale, turn the scale on so I get it tared to 0. Once it's at 0, I make sure that the unit measurement is set to grams, not milliliters, but grams. That's important. And then I have my handy dandy tool. I love this spatula because it gets into the jars. It has a flat bottom so it can scrape the bottom of the jar. It has corners to get around in the sides of the jar where things get stuck and don't get stirred. And it isn't metal, so you're not going to hear it clinking and cracking the glass. I mean, conceivably, having metal hit glass can weaken your glass. So if you're using canning jars, you don't want to have this broken in the midst of canning. Good idea to use something on the plastic or rubber side. Anyways, the other thing I use is an unbleached coffee filter for a little hat to keep over the starter, and to keep it from falling off, I use a rubber band and just put it over so it can wear the little hat. I use another rubber band. This one's green. It's always nice to have a colored one so you can see, but I'll wrap it around the bottom of the jar, and this will help us when we get our flour and water in. We can see whether or not it's rising based on the rubber band. We'll mark it where it starts, where our starter starts on our start date. Wow. And we'll go from there. Okay, so we want to make sure we're at 0 grams. And now let's take the little lid off. And I know somebody's going to say the rubber band weighs something, but it doesn't register. So now we're going to put 50 grams of freshly ground flour. This is kind of a mixture I was doing the other day, but it will work. You can use ancient grains. Their gluten structure isn't as strong, but you can use them. There's no problem with actually using them. But I find that the hard wheat varieties have a high protein and are probably the best. I'm going to use my finger because it's taking a while to register. Okay, there is 50 grams. I always end up getting something all over. Now you want some water, 50 grams of water, and lukewarm is great. You don't need much. And now, to make life really easy, you can turn it off and back on to 0, so you know when you got the 50 grams, or you can just add to it, and if you're not resetting it, you would want to go up to 100 grams if you've still got your weight of your flour on your scale. We're going up to 50 because we re-tiered the scale. And you want to go slow. That's 49. Now, that's 50 exactly. If you're not right on the money, don't sweat it too terribly bad. It doesn't have to be exact science. It's science, but it's forgiving. Now, I turned off my scale. I'm going to stir this. And I'm using a straight glass, a wide mouth glass jar, because glass is the best. You can see what it's doing when it's rising. And the straight sides help me scrape it down and keep it cleaner. If you're going to get mold growing in your starter, which doesn't happen as a rule, but if and when it does, it's typically on the stuff at the top that's stuck to the jar and dries out and starts to grow mold. Make sure you stir really well. You'll be surprised at the dry bits of flour at the bottom of the jar. You want to get them all stirred in real well. And once you're convinced that this all stirred and all the flour is wet and gotten enough, I take my spatula and I run down the sides, and you'd be amazed how clean it can get with just this little operation of scraping the sides down. And now I've got a starter. You want to adjust your rubber band so that it is where the starter is on the jar, so you can see when it actually rises based on the rubber band. The other tip, very, very, very important, is do not leave this little bit of starter on your spatula. Clean it off right away, because when it dries, it's like cement. You won't get it off. The other big tip, do not, under any circumstances, wash this down the drain, or you'll have plumbing problems. Santa won't be coming to see you. Make sure to wipe it off. Whoa. That's what I get for having a cord on my microphone. Make sure to wipe it off with a paper towel and dispose of it in the garbage. And that goes for little bits on your fingers. If you have a big bowl that you've been making bread in, I suggest you fill it with cold water and volume of water to dilute the starter, and so it doesn't become like cement. Make sure to wipe off the top of your lid, or your jar rather, because sticky starter, wet starter, acts like glue. When you put your coffee filter on, it'll stick, and the next day you'll be ripping it off. Now we're going to put his little hat on. And sorry I don't get better camera angles. Hopefully soon I will have this down better and be able to give you a little bit better shots. Anyways, it just has to be on there well enough that it's not going to go anywhere. But this is my little starter. It lives like this on the counter. And some people will use a marker instead of a rubber band. It's either way. But you want to keep it at room temperature. Now, if your room is warm, it's going to rise much faster and have more activity. If your room is cold, it's going to be slower. And this is real important when you're doing the ferments in sourdough and making bread. Understanding the principles of the sourdough starter and how it works with temperatures and humidity, it all plays into getting that perfect loaf. So we're going to put this over here on the counter, and we'll see you tomorrow. It's now 24 hours later, and the starter has formed a few small bubbles, but no discernible activity. There's a little bit of mounding at the top where it's thick, and that's what you want, a nice stiff starter. This is the beginning of feeding routine for the starter. Every day, about 24 hours, you want to feed it so it gets a fresh amount of flour and water, which is its food. If you don't, it'll get hungry and it will start to form a liquid on the top. Now, in order to know how much I need to feed it, I'm going to tare my scale with an empty jar the same size so that it reads a 0. Want to make sure it's registering in grams, not milliliters or ounces. Once I have it tared at 0, I can put this with the starter on the scale, and it's at 101. It'll be somewhere around 100, 101, or 99, thereabouts. I want to discard half of the starter and feed back equal amounts of flour and water. So if it's 100 grams, I will remove 50 grams from the jar and feed 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. That'll be a total of 150 grams, which is basically what I keep my starter at. Because of using whole grain flour, it's heavier and denser, and I typically will use about 100 to 120 grams of starter for a loaf, one loaf of whole grain sourdough bread. So it has enough rise power. I use paper towels to put the discard on so that I can dispose of it in the garbage and not in the sink. So it's got a little dried on the top, but that's okay. It's very stiff starter. Look at that, how it's already forming gluten bonds. That's 56. I need to take it down to about 50. That is 50 on the money. All right. Now I wipe off my spatula onto the paper towel. Makes it nice and easy. 50 grams of freshly milled flour. I believe this is a combination of hard white wheat and red fife that I had ground. So now I'm going to zero out my scale at 50 grams. $44. $52. Close enough. It's not exact, don't worry about it. If it's just close enough, good enough. Like I like to say, good enough for government work. Okay, now I'm going to use my empty jar that I used to tare the scale and use it to fill it with water, to do 50 grams of water. I'll zero out my scale, get 50 grams of water. I'm going to use just lukewarm tap water, not cold, not hot, just comfortably warm to the touch, about room temperature. And now I'm going to use the scale to measure out 50 grams. Exactly. Now I'm done with the scale. I can turn it off. Stir this really well. Completely incorporate it so that the flour is completely wet and no dry pockets of flour in the corners remain. This is where it happens to be really handy to have a good tool that can reach the bottom and not clink around and break your glass. Okay. Again, I like to scrape down the sides and keep those as clean as possible so you don't get any kind of funky. And tomorrow at about the same time, feed it again. Make sure your rubber band is adjusted accordingly because this is going to be changed, the volume from using 50 grams of flour and water yesterday for a total of 100. We now have 50 grams of starter along with 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water for a total of 150. Now, we've got this all pretty much set here. Now tomorrow on the next day, I'll come back and every day thereafter remove the starter where I have 100 grams remaining and I'll feed it 100 grams. I will remove 100 grams and leave 50 grams remaining and feed it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water so that I maintain 150 grams total. So, good night. That's all there is to it. Not that hard. Almost forgot to tell you.
What?
Take the paper towels with your starter. I like to fold them up in thirds and carry them by the other two sides so I don't get leakage to get to the garbage. When you have a stiff starter, you don't have as much to leak. All right. See you later. Believe it or not, this is the very next day. But there's more to the story. Our fungus among us is thriving, but we've just gotten started. Join me back here next time when I share how and when to save your starter in the event of unexpected circumstances, and what to do if your starter has issues. There's so much more to explore in the world of sourdough. Aren't you glad you're here for the ride? Destination: the greatest dough on earth. Thanks for watching, and until next time, may all your bakes be blessed.